The first celebration of the entry of the Saints into the Salt Lake Valley was held on July 24, 1849, the second anniversary of the event. Of that grand festival in the wilderness, the following description was given.
The inhabitants were awakened by the firing of cannon accompanied by music. The brass band playing martial airs was then carried through the city, returning to the Bower by 7 o'clock. At 7:30, the large national flag, measuring 65 feet in length, was unfurled at the top of the Liberty Pole, which is 104 feet high, and was saluted by the firing of 6 guns, the ringing of the Nauvoo bell, and spirit-stirring airs from the band.
In 1849, President Brigham Young established the Perpetual Immigration Fund. This revolving fund was designed to bring to the mountains all worthy Latter-day Saints who had been exiled from Illinois. It was later extended to include the worthy poor among the saints in all the world. Donations were made by the saints having some substance to share. The resulting fund was to become perpetual, by reason of the aided saints returning the same in labor or otherwise as soon as their circumstances will admit, and with interest if required. It is estimated that over 100,000 saints were brought to Utah through the Perpetual Immigration Fund Company between the years of 1849 and 1887. The company was legalized by the state of Deseret September 14, 1850, and by the territory of Utah on October 4, 1851. During this early period in Utah territory, President Brigham Young sent out numerous exploring and settlement companies to investigate and secure vast areas of the country. Among the most important of these was the Southern Exploring Company. Under the presidency of Elder Parley P. Pratt, William W. Phelps, and David Fulmer, a company of 50 men left Salt Lake City on November 25, 1849, to examine the country to the south. The men took with them 12 wagons, 1 carriage, 24 yoke of cattle, 38 horses and mules, an odometer to measure distance, and a brass cannon for protection. The Southern Exploring Company traveled from Salt Lake to Fort Utah, Provo, which was on a 17-acre plot about 100 rods from the Provo River and consisted of 57 log houses. Proceeding on through Utah and Juab valleys to Salt Creek, Nephi, the company went up Salt Creek Canyon and east over a range of the Wasatch Mountains into St. Pete Valley. After visiting with Isaac Morley at the newly formed St. Pete settlement, Manti, the brethren moved south to the Sevier Valley. Here they met Walker, the Ute Indian chief. Finding that many of the Indians were sick, and at the request of Chief Walker, Parley P. Pratt, Dan Jones, and Demick B. Huntington, went and prayed for the Indians, laying hands on them in the name of Jesus. The sick were then given a supply of nourishing food and some good medical advice. Elder Pratt and his fellow pioneers followed the Sevier River for a distance, and then again cut back through a range of the Wasatch Mountains and on into the Little Salt Lake Valley. A reduced company of 20 men, on horseback and leading pack animals, continued southward through difficult terrain. Dropping over the rim of the Great Basin, the party reached the junction of the Rio Virgin and Santa Clara rivers. Much to their surprise, there was no snow, and the climate was found to be warm and spring-like. The men were in what was later called Utah-Dixie. After visiting an Indian village on the Santa Clara River, the explorers made their return in a northerly direction to Salt Lake City and reported the results of the expedition to President Young. Within 10 years, colonists were sent out to almost every point of settlement recommended by the Southern Exploring Company. Notable among these communities was Fillmore, the first capital city of the territory of Utah. The principle of plural marriage, as revealed by the Lord to the prophet Joseph Smith and practiced by him and a few leading brethren in Nauvoo, was not publicly announced until 1852. On August 29, 1852, in conjunction with a special conference of the saints held at Salt Lake City, President Brigham Young called upon Elder Orson Pratt to make a public statement of the doctrine. From this time until the issuing of the manifesto by President Wilford Woodruff on October 6, 1890, the LDS Church stood firmly committed before the world to plural marriage as a practiced religious principle. At the time of the 1852 announcement, no civil laws existed against such covenants. During the next several decades, the United States government took strong legislative action against those participating in the doctrine of the plurality of wives. The saints were also forced to face a rising storm of public opposition, which became increasingly bitter. From the time they left Nauvoo, the saints looked forward to the moment when they could again build a temple in which to worship their Creator. On Saturday, February 14, 1853, several thousand people gathered at the site designated for the erection of a new house of the Lord. After surveying the plot and forming the lines of the building, a hollow square was formed by the saints. The civil and military organizations of the city and several bands were represented in the throng which had assembled for the special groundbreaking ceremony. President Brigham Young and others spoke to the multitude. Following their remarks, President Heber C. Kimball offered the consecrating prayer from the same small buggy from which President Young had spoken. President Kimball blessed the site as a holy place where no unclean thing should ever approach. President Young and other brethren then broke ground at the southeast corner of the planned building. After being dismissed, many remained to work on the excavation. So anxious were they that the preliminary construction began immediately. On April 6, 1853, the cornerstones of the Salt Lake Temple were laid. A 40-year construction project had commenced. The attempts of the saints to maintain peace with the Indians were not always successful. President Young's attempts to stop the slave trade among the Indians had not been well accepted by Chief Walker and others who profited from that business. The Walker War, which had begun so tragically on July 17, 1853, was officially concluded in the mountains east of Nephi at Chicken Creek, Juab County in May of 1854, with President Brigham Young and Chief Joseph Walker negotiating a peaceful settlement. During the war, there were some 12 white casualties, and an undetermined number of Indians were killed. In spite of the strong emotions involved, the parties were able to smoke the ceremonial peace pipe and put an end to their grievances during the two-day conference. After discussion with the Mormon and Indian leaders, Chief Walker gave his decision to stop the warfare.
Wakara has heard all the talk of the good Mormon chief. Wakara no like to go to war with him. Wakara talk with Great Spirit. Great Spirit say, make peace. Wakara love Mormon chief. He is a good man. When Mormon first come to live on Wakara's land, Wakara give him welcome. He give Wakara plenty bread and clothes to cover his wife and children.
Chief Walker and his half-brother Arapeen were both baptized into the LDS Church. Walker died at Meadow Creek in Millard County on January 29, 1855. Among his final words was a plea for his tribe to live at peace with the white settlers and not to harm them. During 1855 to 56, the Saints experienced a severe famine in Utah Territory. A lack of sufficient water brought on a condition of drought which caused many of the crops to fail. There was also a grasshopper plague that invaded the existing crops. In addition to these problems, great numbers of cattle died on the ranges because of the severity of that winter. The lessening of available food became critical. Under these circumstances, measures were taken to assist those who could not help themselves. President Young declared a fast day for the church to be observed on the first Thursday of each month. Persons having the necessary bread put their families on rations in order to save those who had not. Life-giving food was distributed among the poor. President Kimball felt that there was a hidden blessing and a warning to the saints in the midst of these difficulties when he stated,
"Perhaps many feel a little sober because our bread is cut off, but I am glad of it, because it will be a warning to us and teach us to lay it up in future, as we have been told. How many times have you been told to store up your wheat against the hard times that are coming upon the nations of the earth?"
A heavy immigration of saints during 1855 added further to the burden placed on the food supply. The rigid rationing necessary to see the people through the winter and spring caused some Mormons to advise that the immigration of new saints be cut back sharply for 1856. This was particularly true when the Perpetual Immigration Fund donations fell off because of the economic distress. Nevertheless, the church leaders indicated that immigration to Utah Territory would not be reduced. Instead, they announced,
"The cry of our poor brethren in foreign lands for deliverance is great. The hand of the oppressor is heavy upon them, and they can have no other prospect on earth through which they can ask for assistance."
In order to lessen the cost of bringing a foreign saint to Utah, President Brigham Young announced a new plan for mass immigration. He stated,
"I have been thinking how we should operate another year. We cannot afford to purchase wagons and teams as in times past. I am consequently thrown back upon my old plan to make handcarts, and let the emigration foot it, and draw upon them, the carts, the necessary supplies, having a cow or two for every 10. They can come just as quick, if not quicker, and much cheaper."
the immigrating saints were to be sent out from Liverpool, England on sailing ships chartered by church agents. Instructions for the 1856 season were published in the Millennial Star January 12, 1856. Only those individuals choosing to come by handcart were to receive aid from the Perpetual Immigration Fund. The majority of the saints forming the first two handcart companies left Liverpool on April 18, 1856, aboard the ship Enoch Train. They then went westward to Iowa City, Iowa, the terminus of the railroad. In Iowa City, they were met by church agents who had assembled the necessary handcarts and supplies. The handcart companies were organized with about 5 individuals to a handcart. Approximately 20 persons were assigned to a tent. Those saints in a particular tent were under a president or tent captain, and the inhabitants of 5 tents were under the direction of a captain of 100. Each individual was allowed to have 17 pounds of baggage. The first 2 companies to leave Iowa City, Iowa were organized early in June. The majority of the people pulled handcarts, while a few saints accompanied in wagons. A returning missionary, Edmund Ellsworth, was called to command the first company. and Daniel D. MacArthur, another missionary returning home, was selected as captain of the second company. As the handcart pioneers continued west toward Utah Territory, Archer Walters of the Ellsworth Company described an anxious moment with an Indian war party.
One day we were stopped on the Platte River by a large band of Indians who demanded food. They were in war paint and were very hostile. Captain Ellsworth talked to them and told the brethren to pray while he talked. He gave them some beads and they let us go. I never left my handcart for a day and only rode over 2 rivers. We waded streams, crossed high mountains, and pulled through heavy sand, leaving comfortable homes, father, mother, brother, and sister, to be where we could hear a prophet's voice and live with the saints of Zion.
Brother Walters herein identifies the primary reason for the thousands of saints who gathered, that they might hear a prophet's voice and live with the saints of Zion. These first 2 companies also arrived in Salt Lake City on the same day, September 26, 1856. President Wilford Woodruff, a counselor to President Young, recorded his impressions of that important event when he wrote,
"One of the most interesting scenes that was ever witnessed in our territory was the arrival of 2 of the handcart companies on the 26th inst. Having heard the night previous that they were camped between the 2 mountains, President Young and Kimball and many citizens with a detachment of the Lancers and the brass bands went out to meet and escort them into the city. They met the companies at the foot of the little mountain. Elder E. Ellsworth led the first company and Elder Daniel D. MacArthur the second. I must say my feelings were inexpressible to behold a company of men and women and children, many of them aged and infirm, enter the city of the Great Salt Lake, drawing 100 handcarts, led by Brother Ellsworth, who assisted in drawing the first handcart, with which they had traveled some 1,400 miles in 9 weeks, and to see them dance with joy as they traveled through the streets. This sight filled our hearts with joy and thanksgiving to God. As I gazed upon the scene, meditating upon the future result, it looked to me like the first hoisting of the floodgate of deliverance to the oppressed millions. We can now say to the poor and honest in heart, come home to Zion, for the way is prepared."
The first and second handcart companies successfully pulled the road to Zion, as did the third under Captain Edward Bunker, whose company was made up almost entirely of Welshmen. However, the fourth and fifth companies, commanded by Elders James G. Willey and Edward Martin, ran into serious difficulty. The seeds of tragedy were sown very early in their immigration to Utah. These latter companies were unduly late in sailing from Liverpool because of the difficulty in procuring ships and making arrangements for the approximately 1,610 emigrants. The arrival of such a large number of saints on June 26th and July 8th, respectively, apparently caught the church agents at Iowa City unawares. The required number of handcarts had not been prepared. Every available hand was immediately set to work building carts and sewing tents. Elder Willey's company consisted of 500 persons. They had with them 120 handcarts, 5 wagons, 24 oxen, and 45 beef cattle and cows. Captain Martin's party comprised of 576 individuals with 146 handcarts, 7 wagons, 30 oxen, and 50 cows and beef cattle. 2 ox trains traveled immediately behind them, one under Captain W.B. Hodgett, consisting of 33 wagons and 185 people. The second was commanded by Captain John A. Hunt with 200 immigrants. The 277-mile journey from Iowa City to Florence, Nebraska was accomplished in less than 4 weeks. Unfortunately, the hot sun of July and August took its toll, as the unseasoned lumber in the carts was warped and cracked by the heat. Similarly, a number required new axles, and all of the carts had a piece of iron screwed on the wheels to prevent them from wearing away so rapidly. The constant delays were costly and precious time. At Florence, the leaders debated whether or not the season was too far advanced to chance a safe journey through the mountains. According to John Chislett, Levi Savage
declared positively that to his certain knowledge we could not cross the mountains with a mixed company of aged people, women and little children, so late in the season, without much suffering, sickness, and death. He therefore advised going into winter quarters without delay.
Elder Savage was voted down in the anxiety of others to get to the mountains that very year. True to his desires to serve his fellow saints, Levi Savage then announced,
"Brethren and sisters, what I have said I know to be true, but seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and, if necessary, I will die with you. May God in his mercy bless and preserve us. Amen.
It was not until August 18th and 27th, respectively, that the Willie and Martin companies resumed their individual journeys to the west. Brother Savage's warning forgotten in the comparative ease of the hour. The Willie Company reached Fort Laramie on September 1st. The provisions which had been expected from the Salt Lake Valley were not there. They were informed that they would be received at South Pass. Rations, which were dangerously low, were again reduced. The nights became colder and the mountains were mantled in snow nearly to their base. Fatigue and overexertion produced their effects. John Chislett of the Willie Company remembered the frequent deaths that followed.
Death was not long confined in its ravages to the old and infirm, but the young and naturally strong were among its victims. Many a father pulled his cart with his little children on it until the day preceding his death. I have seen some pull their carts in the morning, give out during the day, and die before next morning. Each death weakened our forces. In my 100, I could not raise enough men to pitch a tent when we camped, and now it was that I had to exert myself to the utmost. I wonder I did not die as many did who were stronger than I was. When we pitched our camp in the evening of each day, I had to lift the sick from the wagon and carry them to the fire, and in the morning, carry them again on my back to the wagon. When any in my 100 died, I had to inter them, often helping to dig the grave myself. In performing these sad offices, I always offered up a heartfelt prayer to that God who beheld our sufferings and begged him to avert destruction from us and send us help.
The critical conditions facing the handcart companies were conveyed to President Brigham Young by President Franklin D. Richards, who had overtaken the Willie and Martin companies on his way to the Salt Lake Valley. The brethren were unaware that such a large body of saints was then en route. The semi-annual conference of the church was just convening at the time the news arrived, and President Young used this opportunity to mobilize a rescue force on October 5, 1856. Addressing the saints assembled, President Young asserted,
I shall call upon the bishops this day. I shall not wait until tomorrow nor until the next day for 60 good mule teams and 12 or 15 wagons. I do not want to send oxen. I want good horses and mules. They are in this territory, and we must have them. Also 12 tons of flour and 40 good teamsters, besides those that drive the teams. This is dividing my texts into heads. First, 40 good young men who know how to drive teams, to take charge of the teams that are now managed by men, women, and children who know nothing about driving them. Second, 60 or 65 good spans of mules or horses, with harness, whippletrees, neck yokes, stretchers, lead chains, and so forth. And thirdly, 24,000 pounds of flour, which we have on hand. I will tell you all that your faith, religion, and profession of religion will never save one soul of you in the celestial kingdom of our God unless you carry out just such principles as I am now teaching you. Go and bring in those people now on the plains and attend strictly to those things which we call temporal duties. Otherwise, your faith will be in vain.
The blacksmiths in the congregation were then called on to retire, as they were needed to shoe the horses and repair the rescue wagons. On the morning of October 7th, 16 wagon loads of food and supplies and 27 hardy pioneers headed eastward with the first assistance to those stranded on the plains. The advance train moved out of the valley, camped at the foot of Big Mountain, and then proceeded eastward through the winter storms. Pausing only momentarily at Fort Bridger, they reached the Green River and then struggled the distance to South Pass. While encamped at Willow Creek on the upper reaches of the Sweetwater, the rescue company was greeted by Captain J.G. Willie and Joseph Elder of the 4th Handcart Company. The next day, the Utah boys reached the main handcart encampment in time to save most of the lives of the Willie Company. Large fires were kindled, foodstuffs were handed out, and warm blankets were issued to the cold and hungered saints. Through the eventual aid of scores of teams, the 4th Handcart Company arrived in Salt Lake City on November 9, 1856. Approximately 67 out of 500 members had perished en route. Those rescuers aiding the more rearward 5th Handcart Company under Edward Martin helped the beleaguered saints move on to the Sweetwater River. Many of the handcart pioneers wept at the sight of the river filled with floating ice, not knowing how they could face this new ordeal in their weakened condition. This overwhelming dilemma was resolved by the heroic action of 3 young men from the rescue company.
3 18-year-old boys belonging to the relief party came to the rescue, and to the astonishment of all who saw, carried nearly every member of that ill-fated handcart company across the snowbound stream. The strain was so terrible, and the exposure so great, that in later years all the boys died from the effects of it. When President Young heard of this heroic act, he wept like a child and later declared publicly,
That act alone will ensure C. Allen Huntington, George W. Grant, and David P. Kimball an everlasting salvation in the celestial kingdom of God, world without end.
The company then moved to a depression about 2½ miles from Devil's Gate, which later became known as Martin's Cove. Here many died and were buried in shallow graves. There were between 135 and 150 deaths out of the 576 members in the Edward Martin Company. Many deaths were averted because of the exceptional exertions of the rescuers. One of the men who performed unusual service in the saving of the 5th Handcart Company was called to assist in a miraculous manner. Ephraim K. Hanks, an outstanding frontiersman and scout, was staying at a friend's home south of Salt Lake and later told this unusual experience.
I retired to rest quite early. While I still lay wide awake in my bed, I heard a voice calling me by name and then saying, "The Handcart people are in trouble and you are wanted. Will you go and help them?" I turned instinctively in the direction from whence the voice came and beheld an ordinary-sized man in the room. Without any hesitation, I answered, "Yes, I will go if I am called." I then turned around to go to sleep, but had laid only a few minutes when the voice called a second time, repeating almost the same words as on the first occasion. My answer was the same as before. This was repeated a third time.
F. hurried to Salt Lake, arriving on the Saturday before the general call for assistance made by President Young. When that call was made, F. said, "I am ready now." And the next day, he was wending his way over the mountains. Eve Hanks and another rescuer, Reddick in Allred, made camp at South Pass. Here they waited for the Martin Company to arrive. Both men were caught in a terrific snowstorm. Feeling the urgency of hurrying on, Eve could wait no longer. Borrowing a pack saddle and 2 animals from Brother Allred, he continued eastward through the snow. Brother Hanks told him an immediate answer to prayer, which he experienced as he bedded down on the trail. He said,
I camped in the snow in the mountains. As I was preparing to make a bed in the snow with a few articles that my pack animal carried for me, I thought of how comfortable a buffalo robe would be on such an occasion, and also how I could relish a little buffalo meat for supper. And before lying down for the night, I was instinctively led to ask the Lord to send me a buffalo. Now, I am a firm believer in the efficacy of prayer, for I have, on many different occasions, asked the Lord for blessings which He in His mercy has bestowed on me. But when I, after praying as I did on that lonely night in the South Pass, looked around me and spied a buffalo bull within 50 yards of my camp, my surprise was complete. I had certainly not expected so immediate an answer to my prayer. However, I soon collected myself and was not at loss to know what to do. Taking deliberate aim at the animal, my first shot brought him down. He made a few jumps only and then rolled down into the very hollow where I was encamped. I was soon busily engaged skinning my game, finishing which I spread the hide on the snow and placed my bed upon it.
The next day, Eve happened on a herd of buffalo and was impressed to shoot a nice-sized cow. Although his experience with the bull the previous night had supplied him with more than sufficient for his immediate use. However, he soon discovered the more pressing need for his life-giving supply of meat. Eve related,
I reached the ill-fated train just as the immigrants were camping for the night. The sight that met my gaze as I entered their camp could never be erased from my memory. The starved forms and haggard countenances of the poor sufferers as they moved about slowly, shivering with cold, to prepare their scanty evening meal, was enough to touch the stoutest heart. When they saw me coming, they hailed me with joy inexpressible, and when they further beheld the supply of fresh meat I brought into camp, their gratitude knew no bounds. Flocking around me, one would say, "Oh, please give me a small piece of meat." Another would exclaim, "My poor children are starving, do give me a little." And children with tears in their eyes would call out, "Give me some, give me some."
Eve shot a number of buffalo to feed the famished immigrants on their journey to Salt Lake. The people were unable to sufficiently express their gratitude for this great brother. As the Martin Handcart Company drew near to Salt Lake City on Sunday, November 30th, 1856, the saints were worshiping in the tabernacle with President Young. When news was brought of the imminent arrival of the 5th Handcart Company, President Young stated to the congregation,
"When those persons arrive, I do not want to see them put in houses by themselves. I want to have them distributed among the families that have good and comfortable houses. And I wish all the sisters now before me, and all who know how and can, to nurse and wait upon the newcomers, and prudently administer medicine and food. To speak upon these things is a part of my religion, for it pertains to taking care of the saints. The afternoon meeting will be omitted, for I wish the sisters to go home and prepare to give those who have just arrived a mouthful of something to eat, and to wash them and nurse them up. You know that I would give more for a dish of pudding and milk or a baked potato and salt, were I in the situation of those persons who have just come in, than I would for all your prayers, though you were to stay here all afternoon and pray. Prayer is good, but when baked potatoes and pudding and milk are needed, prayer will not supply their place on this occasion. Give every duty its proper time and place."
The era of the handcarts lasted from 1856 to 1860. During that period, 10 companies pulled their way to Zion, bringing with them nearly 3,000 saints. It required great resolution and deep religious faith to give these souls the strength necessary to endure the heat, cold, hunger, and fatigue experienced on the long, scourging trail to the Salt Lake Valley. Even as church leaders planned for continued handcart and wagon migrations to Utah, problems of a serious nature were being generated which eventually posed a direct threat to Mormonism in the West. One of the major factors in the difficulty was William W. Drummond, who had been appointed an associate justice in Utah Territory by the administration of President Pierce. Judge Drummond was well known for the immorality of his private life and had deserted a wife and children in Illinois. Drummond brought a woman with him to Utah whom he falsely identified as his wife. This Carroll woman frequently sat on the bench with him as he administered justice in the name of the Republic. This conduct and other evidence of bad character were strongly denounced by the Mormons. In his federal office, Judge Drummond ignored the special powers given the probate courts by legislative enactment. He also never missed an opportunity to protest against the institution of plural marriage as practiced by the Mormons. Finding that he had completely lost his effectiveness and station with the people, Judge Drummond deserted his post. Under the guise of holding court for Judge George P. Stiles in Carson Valley, Nevada, Drummond became a runaway official. Going first into California and then to the east via the Isthmus of Panama, he submitted his resignation to the Attorney General, Jeremiah S. Black. In his resignation, he listed a series of charges against Governor Brigham Young and the Mormon people. Although unfounded, these accusations were unfortunately acted upon by the new administration of President James Buchanan. In addition to the protests of Judge Drummond, complaints had previously been made against the Mormons by W.F. McGraw, who lost his U.S. mail contract to Hiram Kimball when that saint offered the low bid. McGraw sent a letter directly to President James Buchanan stating his obligation to inform the chief executive of the political and social situation among the Mormons. He stated that within Utah, there is left no vestige of law and order, no protection for life or property. Although President Brigham Young made every effort to supply President James Buchanan with the true facts in the matter, the administration chose to listen to the charges of the enemies of the saints. Motivated by this combination of factors, the administration at Washington determined to take drastic action in the question of
the community and in part the civil government of Utah Territory being in substantial rebellion against the laws and authority of the United States.
While Congress was adjourned in the spring of 1857, President James Buchanan and Secretary of War John B. Floyd determined that the best way to settle the Utah situation would be to name new officials for the territory and to ensure their installment by sending a military escort to support their authority. This was to be done in secret without public announcement. The plan was designed to be carried out before the Mormons were aware of the government's intentions. Unfortunately, this approach had just the opposite effect and resulted in fears and hostilities that might have been minimized had the administration been more open in informing the Mormons of their intent. Without a careful examination of the actual conditions in Utah, President James Buchanan called for 2,500 United States Army troops to be sent to Utah Territory in order to put down a supposed rebellion among the Mormons. In an attempt to preserve the secrecy of the troop movements, a hold was placed on the U.S. mail for Utah, At the same time, soldiers and supply trains began their journey to the west. Discovery of their intended destination, however, was soon learned by the Mormons. Abraham O. Smoot, mayor of Salt Lake City, was headed east with the June mail, between Fort Laramie and New Fort Kearney. Elder Smoot met 200 or 300 U.S. troops on the march. 100 miles out of Independence, Missouri, he encountered the first heavily laden government supply wagons. His interest aroused. Mayor Smoot inquired as to their destination. The teamsters would only say that they were headed to some western post under contract to William R. Russell of Independence. When the mayor reached that community, he called on Mr. Russell and learned that the wagon's destination was Salt Lake City, and that the supplies were for a large contingent of troops that would follow. Abraham O. Smoot next visited the postmaster in Independence. He discovered that the mail contract given to Hiram Kimball, a Mormon, had been canceled. This meant that the YX company was out of the mail business. Mayor Smoot immediately headed toward Utah, discontinuing the company's mail stations as he did so, and directing the various agents to help him drive the stock westward. About 120 miles east of Fort Laramie, Mayor Smoot met Orrin Porter Rockwell carrying the July mail from Utah. Upon hearing the situation, Rockwell joined Smoot's westbound company. At Fort Laramie, Abraham O. Smoot, Orrin Porter Rockwell, and Judson Stoddard decided that they should make a run for Salt Lake City and warn the Saints of the approaching army. Hitching up 2 span of their best horses to a light spring wagon, they left Fort Laramie on the evening of July 18, 1857, and arrived in Salt Lake City on the evening of July 23rd. By pushing their animals and themselves, these men had traveled 513 miles in 5 days. Disappointedly, they found that President Brigham Young was not in the city. President Young and a company numbering 2,587 people and 464 carriages and wagons had gone to the head of Big Cottonwood Canyon east of Salt Lake to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the entry of the pioneers into the valley. Interestingly, for a people who had been declared in open rebellion against the U.S. government, there were 2 large American flags unfurled from 2 of the tallest trees on a pair of high peaks inside of the encampment. The stars and stripes meant much more to the Saints than a passive symbol of patriotism. On July 24th, brothers Smoot, Rockwell, and Stoddard, accompanied by Judge Elias Smith, rode into camp from Salt Lake City. They quietly sought out President Young and delivered their message to him and other leaders. News of the approaching army was not given to the larger body until its members assembled for prayers at sunset. At that time, President Wells, Daniel H. Wells, made a few remarks in relation to the latest tidings from the States, upon the order of leaving the grounds in the morning, and concluded with prayer. The announcement that troops were headed for the territory was not allowed to dull the merriment of the 24th of July celebration. Singing and dancing were enjoyed until a late hour. The next morning, the Saints broke camp and returned to their homes, prepared to take any action which their leaders might direct. News that 1/6 of the United States regular army was marching toward Utah did not panic the Saints. They went to their homes with the firm resolve to withstand any unhallowed crusade against them. President Brigham Young reflected the feelings of the people when he stated to a large assembly,
"We have transgressed no law. We have no occasion to do so. Neither do we intend to. But as for any nations coming to destroy this people, God Almighty being my helper, they cannot come here."
The congregation responded by a loud Amen. Orders for the Saints' defense were sent to the 13 district commanders of the Nauvoo Legion by General Daniel H. Wells on August 1st, 1857. In the emergency, the church leaders felt the necessity of calling home all of the apostles and missionaries and certain of the saints on settlement missions. Elders Amasa Lyman and Charles C. Rich were instructed to break up the San Bernardino settlement and bring the people back to Utah. Similarly, Elder Orson Hyde, in charge of the Carson Valley Saints, was to see that those saints returned to the aid in the defense. The first Mormon troops called to active duty were a detachment of 75 mounted men under the command of Colonel Robert T. Burton. His orders specified that he was to guard the incoming Mormon immigrant trains arriving from the States. He was also directed to locate the U.S. Army forces approaching Utah and determine their strength and type of equipment. Colonel Burton was to report their movements to the Utah headquarters. General Wells placed the command under strict orders not to interfere with the life or property of anyone. Burton's troops arrived at Fort Bridger on August 21st, 1857, and 5 days later at Pacific Springs they met the first of the Mormon immigrant companies. The next day, Colonel Burton sighted several government supply trains traveling without the protection of a military escort. Proceeding eastward, the colonel and his men located the government troops. On September 22nd, Colonel Edmund B. Alexander's division, comprising the 5th and 19th United States Infantry Regiments with Phelps and Reno's batteries, encamped at Devil's Gate. Colonel Burton and 3 Mormon troopers also bedded down within 1/2 mile of them. As the expedition forces moved, So did Colonel Burton, keeping Governor Young and General Wells continuously informed through express riders to Salt Lake City as to the progress of the enemy. On September 15, 1857, Brigham Young issued a proclamation by the governor which forbade all armed forces of every description from coming into this territory under any pretense whatever. To back up this declaration, 1,250 Mormon men were ordered to report to Echo Canyon to take up defense positions. General Daniel H. Wells, with elders John Taylor and George A. Smith, joined the forces and began the construction of fortifications and breastworks in the Narrows and along the heights of Echo Canyon. With this work commenced, General Wells rode on to Fort Bridger, now Mormon property following its purchase from Jim Bridger. At the fort, General Wells met with Colonel Robert T. Burton and other leaders to get their reports. They informed him of the United States forces under command of Colonel Alexander and of their base of operations, Camp Winfield, named after General Winfield Scott, located on Ham's Fork. As General Wells continued discussions with officers of the Nauvoo Legion at Fort Bridger, it was decided to begin active operations against the U.S. Army's Utah expedition. The grass was to be burned on all routes leading into the Salt Lake Valley so that the Army's animals would have poor grazing. Orrin Porter Rockwell was assigned to assist Major McAllister in burning the grass on the Oregon Trail leading to Soda Springs and then burn other avenues. Officers of the command were further instructed to raid and drive off the enemy's stock wherever the opportunity provided itself. Supplies should be burned and the Army annoyed by any means possible, short of risking the lives of the men. Because Fort Bridger and Fort Supply would soon be overrun by the advancing U.S. Army, the decision was made to burn these Mormon holdings rather than have them fall into the hands of the invaders. Complying with his orders, Lewis Robinson set fire to Fort Bridger on the evening of October 3, 1857. The torch was also applied to Fort Supply about midnight of that same day. Jesse W. Crosby, a member of Colonel Robert T. Burton's command who helped burn Fort Supply, recorded this account of the incident.
The company to which I belonged left Salt Lake City September 25, 1857. We took out our wagons, horses, etc., and at 12 o'clock set fire to the building, Fort Supply, at once, consisting of 100 or more good, hewed log houses, one sawmill, one grist mill, and one threshing machine. And after going out of the fort, we set fire to the stockade works, straw and grain stacks, etc. After looking a few minutes at the bonfire we had made, thence on by the light thereof, I will mention that owners of property in several places begged the privilege of setting fire to their own, which they freely did, thus destroying at once what they had labored for years to build, and that without a word. We then went our way a few miles and stopped to set fire to the city supply, a new place just commenced. There were 10 or 15 buildings, perhaps, and warmed ourselves by the flames. Thus was laid waste, in a few hours, all the labor of a settlement for 3 or 4 years, with some 500 or 600 acres of land fenced and improved.
In keeping with the policy of defensive warfare, Major Lot Smith received his orders from General Wells on October 3rd while yet at Fort Bridger. Major Smith's company of 3 officers and 40 men was to engage any government supply trains coming from South Pass and either cause them to turn back or burn them. The Mormons rode all night, and early the next morning they met an ox train headed west. Major Smith soon convinced the captain of the train, Mr. Rankin, that he should turn his wagons eastward. However, Lot Smith noted that the moment they were out of sight, Captain Rankin turned his wagons around again. This caused the Mormons to take more aggressive action. Major Smith just lay in ambush until after midnight. Finally, when the time was right, the little Mormon company approached the wagons. Lot Smith explained.
I arranged my men, and we advanced until our horses' heads came into the light of the fire. Then I discovered that we had the advantage, for looking back into the darkness, I could not see where my line of troops ended, and could imagine my 20 followers stringing out to 100 or more, as well as not.
Lot called for the commander of the wagon train. When Mr. Dawson stepped into the firelight, Major Smith told him that they had come to burn the wagons and that he, Dawson, and his men might remove their personal belongings. Despite the pleas of Dawson, the camp was disarmed and the wagons set ablaze. Lot Smith and Big James, a Gentile Irishman, applied the torch to one line and then the other, leaving both a pile of ashes. Turning his attention from the burning of wagon trains, Major Smith concentrated on the cattle herds of the Utah expedition. Lot Smith and Orrin Porter Rockwell combined their commands for a raid on the stock of the main camp of the U.S. Army located on Ham's Fork. As the members of the Mormon force looked down from the bluffs above the valley where the cattle were being herded, they estimated the cattle to number 1,400 head. Major Smith's narrative has detailed the events of that moment.
We had to run about 2 miles to reach the cattle, and by the time we got to them, the guards had yoked up teams to 3 wagons and started the herds at double-quick pace for camp. We intercepted them, unyoked the cattle, and turned their heads the other way. The guards were frightened as badly as the cattle and looked as pale as death. They came to me and asked me if we were going to take the stock. I replied that it looked a little as if we would. We rode on and soon overtook our men with the stock. We divided the cattle into suitable herds and drove all night, Porter and I piloting the way.
Porter went on into Salt Lake with the cattle, while Lott returned to the vicinity of the last camp of the Army on Ham's Fork. Major Lott Smith's raiders had been so successful in their activities against the U.S. Army that federal troops under Captain Marcy were directed to hunt them down. Interestingly, Major Smith and his men began to track Captain Marcy's unit in hopes of stealing its mules. As in the fortunes of war, the two commands unexpectedly came directly upon each other while maneuvering in the early morning. Lott Smith stated,
"When they saw us right at their heels, there was some lively scampering for a few moments, and the enemy was brought into line. We halted about 40 yards from them, and I advanced and met Captain Marcy about 20 paces from his line of battle. He introduced himself, saying he supposed I was Captain Smith. I replied in the affirmative. He then said that the soldiers he commanded were United States troops, and asked me what armed force it was I had. I told him they were from Utah. "What is your business out here?" he inquired. "Watching you. What is your business?" I asked. He said they were looking out a way into Utah. "Nonsense," said I. "You have left the main road to the valley long ago. It passes through Echo Canyon. I have been that way myself many a time."
Seeing that he and his men were outnumbered, Major Smith broke contact with Captain Marcy's force and made a run for it. Captain Marcy's men attempted to hem them in, but Lott found a break in the steep bank of the river, and he and his men crossed to the other side. The Utah expedition was plagued with many problems from the beginning, not the least of which was its march to Utah without a clearly designated leader for the journey. Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston had been appointed commander of the U.S. troops, but was detained in Kansas until after his command had actually arrived in the Green River Valley. The senior officer in the field was Colonel Edmund B. Alexander of the 10th Infantry Regiment. Colonel Alexander next called a council of war with his officers. It was decided to march the troops to Fort Hall, 140 miles northwest of Fort Bridger, and establish their winter quarters. Although this would place them farther from Salt Lake City, they would save time in the long run by not having to fight their way through the Mormon fortifications in Echo Canyon. The march toward Fort Hall turned into a disaster. The Mormons continued to drive off many of the troops' cattle and burned the grass needed by the remaining animals. The Nauvoo Legion also felled trees across the trail and otherwise obstructed the Army's progress by digging ditches and rolling rocks into the paths of the wagons. Completely frustrated by these actions, Colonel Alexander finally decided to go back down Ham's Fork and await the arrival of Colonel Johnston. At last, Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston arrived at Alexander's camp on November 2nd, 1857. Disregarding the proposed march to Fort Hall, Colonel Johnston ordered the troops to Fort Bridger, emphatically declaring his intention of forcing his way through Echo Canyon and wintering in Salt Lake City. Colonel Johnston spoke without considering the weather. On November 6th, the snow fell to a great depth. Henry Hamilton, a soldier in Johnston's army, wrote of the severe difficulties experienced as a result of the heavy storm.
"Misfortune seemed to come upon us at every step. The animals dropped and died at almost every rod of progress made. On the night of November 6th, 500 of the animals perished, and this was named the Camp of Death."
The last Army units finally reached Fort Bridger, requiring 15 days to travel a distance of only 34 miles. Colonel Johnston's design of forcing his way through to Salt Lake City was abandoned in the face of the hardships endured on the trail. Going into winter quarters, the Army established 2 camps, one at Fort Bridger and the other, the main encampment, at Camp Scott, named after General Winfield Scott. On November 19th, Colonel Philip St. George Cook, former commander of the Mormon Battalion in the Mexican War, arrived at Camp Scott from the east with 6 companies of the U.S. Army's 2nd Dragoons. With him were most of the new territorial officials assigned to Utah, including Governor Alfred Cumming and Chief Justice Delana R. Eccles. With approximately 2,500 people in camp, the newly commissioned General Johnston settled down for a long winter in the extreme cold of that high mountain region. President Brigham Young and the Saints thanked the Lord for their preservation and prayed that the spring would bring a condition of peace, not war. In Washington, D.C., President James Buchanan came under severe criticism from the U.S. Congress, press, and private citizens for sending an army to Utah without properly investigating the actual circumstances within the territory. He was also under attack for placing a large military body in the field so late in the season that it was forced to endure the extreme hardships of winter snows. President Buchanan was grateful when an old and trusted friend of the Mormons, Colonel Thomas L. Kane, stepped forward and offered to aid the administration. Although he acted in an unofficial capacity, Colonel Kane was encouraged by President Buchanan to do whatever he could in mediating a peaceful solution to the problem. On the evening of his arrival in Salt Lake, the colonel explained his mission to a gathering of the First Presidency and the 12. In succeeding days, it was determined that Colonel Kane should go to the U.S. Army camp and confer with Governor Cumming and other civil officials. Leaving Salt Lake on March 8, 1858, he was guided to the military encampment by Ephraim Hanks, Porter Rockwell, and others. As the party neared Fort Bridger, Colonel Kane dismissed his Mormon escort and rode in alone. Colonel Kane was cordially welcomed by Governor Alfred Cumming. He soon discovered that Cumming was anxious for a peaceful settlement of the hostilities, but that General Johnston wanted a military solution by which they, the Mormons, should be made to submit to the constitutional and legal demands of the government unconditionally. Accepting Colonel Kane's invitation to visit the Mormon capital to investigate circumstances for himself, Governor Cumming and the colonel left for Salt Lake City on April 5th. They were met just outside the Army camp by General William H. Kimball and a small detachment of Mormon cavalry, which escorted them to Salt Lake. It was planned that the part of the journey through Echo and Weber canyons be accomplished in the nighttime, as the Mormons wished to impress Governor Cumming with their military strength. Orson F. Whitney described the show of force put on for the governor.
The hills on either side were bright with bonfires, kindled by the handful of guards patrolling the passes. They were instructed to have some of their number march round and round the fires with a view to creating the impression that the canyon was alive with armed men. Every few rods, the governor's carriage was stopped by a demand for the countersign. This ruse was expected to convince His Excellency, who would of course inform General Johnston, that the little force at Camp Scott was altogether unequal to the mighty host confronting him, and that he had done a wise thing in not attempting to force a passage through the mountains.
The same men who marched around one bonfire and cheered the governor's speeches would then hurry down the mountain to reenact the scene at the next outpost. President Brigham Young cordially welcomed Governor Cumming and was impressed with the quality of the man. Commenting on his reception among the saints, the governor wrote to General Johnston,
"I have been everywhere recognized as governor of Utah, and have been universally greeted with such respectful attentions as are due to the representative authority of the United States in the territory."
He found that court records had not been burned as previously purported, and that certain other charges had also been falsified or blown out of proportion. Cumming became convinced that the administration in Washington, D.C. had acted too hastily in sending federal troops to Utah. The governor's observation was reinforced when he witnessed a distressing condition created by the war. In order to avoid the loss of life and to ensure that there would not be a military occupation of Mormon communities, President Young had called on the saints to abandon their homes and move south. Governor Cumming saw hundreds of Mormons lining the roads in a mass exodus from their communities. The saints were willing to sacrifice everything rather than submit to occupation by a reinforced U.S. Army. Cumming asked Brigham Young if there were not some way to stop this great migration. President Young replied that
if the troops were withdrawn from the territory, the people would stop moving, but that 99 out of every 100 of the people would rather live out their lives in the mountains than endure the oppression the federal government was now heaping upon them. Governor Cumming said he would do all he could to prevent the troops from coming into the settlements.
A young pioneer girl describing the effect of the move south on her particular family remembered.
We packed all we had in Father's one wagon and waited for the command to leave. Along in the middle of the day, Father scattered leaves and straw in all the rooms, and I heard him say, "Never mind, little daughter. This home has sheltered us. It shall never shelter them." I did not understand him then, but as we went out of the yard and joined all the other people on the main road, I learned for the first time that the city was to be burned should the approaching army attack the people. That night we camped on Willow Creek in the south end of the valley, and at 10 o'clock every soul, with bowed head, knelt in prayer to God. As I dropped to sleep, I heard my mother whispering that the Lord had heard our prayers, and that our home should not be burned. I cried and cried, but at last I dropped to sleep.
Over 30,000 saints eventually left their homes and took up a line of march to the south. Provo was designated as the temporary church headquarters. Brother Simon S. Epperson recalled the conditions which he saw in and around that community.
Squatted through the town of Provo and for miles along its northern and western borders were families from the north in every conceivable quality, form, and material for habitation. A cook stove spaced in the open air prepared the food for the family. A few families had canvas tents. At this critical time, the outcome of their future security and happiness seemed to hang in the balance.
Concerned over the future security and happiness of the Saints, Governor Cumming left Salt Lake City for Camp Scott on May 13, 1858. His mission was to persuade General Albert Sidney Johnston not to establish military posts in Salt Lake City and Provo following the Army's entry into the Salt Lake Valley. Colonel Kane accompanied Governor Cumming to Camp Scott and then proceeded on to Washington, D.C. with a Mormon escort. On June 19, 1858, Colonel Kane gave a personal report of conditions in Utah to President Buchanan and also delivered dispatches from Governor Cumming to the Chief Executive. For his untiring services to the Mormon people, Colonel Thomas L. Kane will always have the undying gratitude of the Saints. In a letter of appreciation to that great friend and gentleman, President Young confided,
You, Colonel, are daily and hourly remembered by us all in our supplications to the throne of power and in the domestic circle. We shall ever appreciate the good, the generous, the energetic, and talented little colonel.
Prior to Kane's arrival in the nation's capital, President Buchanan had yielded to public and congressional pressure and called 2 official representatives to serve as a peace commission in settling the conflict in Utah. On June 14, 1858, Governor Cumming, supported by the peace commissioners, declared that President Buchanan's terms for a free and full pardon had been accepted by the Saints. General Johnston marched his troops from Camp Scott through Echo Canyon past the abandoned Mormon fortifications and into Salt Lake, arriving on June 26th. The city was deserted except for the Mormon Home Guard that was stationed in key locations throughout the community to set it ablaze should the actions of the military make it necessary. Johnston's army train, numbering approximately 5,500 men and stretching nearly 8 miles in length, marched through the city in good order without disturbing any property. This unique spectacle in an otherwise abandoned city has been described by a reporter for the Atlantic Monthly.
It was one of the most extraordinary scenes that have occurred in American history. All day long, from dawn till after sunset, the troops and trains poured through the city.
At the head of his regiment, Colonel Philip St. George Cook rode with Johnston's army as it passed through Salt Lake. He is said to have removed his hat out of respect for the men of the Mormon battalion whom he had commanded in the Mexican War 12 years before. General Johnston marched his troops to the banks of the Jordan River west of the city. Here they encamped for 3 days before traveling on to Cedar Valley, 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake. The peaceful entry of the army signaled the end of active hostilities between the opposing forces. On June 30th, 1858, President Brigham Young announced from church headquarters in Provo,
All who wish to return to their homes in Great Salt Lake City were to do so.
Charles A. Scott with General Johnston's army saw the Saints on the road returning north and gave the following description of their circumstances.
The road between Provo and Salt Lake is nearly lined with Mormon families returning to their homes in the north. They are the most destitute-looking set I ever saw.
Over the next 2 months, the thousands of Mormons involved in the move south made their way home to the various northern communities. The Saints were filled with thanksgiving to their Heavenly Father for the restoration of peace to the land of Zion. Outside of accidental gunshot wounds and a fatal heart attack, there were very few human casualties which occurred in the main battle area during the Utah War. Unfortunately, however, far removed from the principal engagement, a horrible crime was committed in southern Utah. At an isolated location known as Mountain Meadows, an immigrant train bound for Southern California was attacked by Indians and whites, and a majority of its members were treacherously massacred. The ill-fated wagon train, known as the Fancher Party, had arrived in Salt Lake City during August 1857 en route to California. The company was made up of 2 elements. Families from Arkansas under Captain Fancher had been joined by a number of self-styled Missouri Wildcats. This latter group seems to have been primarily responsible for the difficulties created between the party and the inhabitants as it moved south. Many stories have been told in an attempt to account for the tragedy which eventually overtook the company. For instance,
reports of their boastful and hateful remarks come to us from many sources. Little things like naming their oxen Brigham Young or Heber C. Kimball, and then cursing them roundly as they passed through the Mormon villages. As tensions grew, there were those who boasted of having participated in the Missouri outrages and the Haun's Mill massacre. One man even claimed to be carrying the gun which shot old Joe Smith. Wait until they reached California and told the people there what was going on in Utah. They'd come back with an army from that direction too, and then these traitorous Mormons would literally be between the hammer and the anvil.
such statements showed a distinct lack of judgment considering the wartime atmosphere then existent in the territory. Perhaps the most serious charges against the Fancher party grew out of an incident purported to have occurred south of Fillmore. Thomas Waters Cropper declared,
They, the Fancher party, moved on over to what was known as the Big Spring on the Corn Creek Sloans. They poisoned the spring, and a number of cattle died around the spring. The Indians ate some of the meat, and several Indians died from the effects. I went over and saw the cattle dead around the spring. Proctor Robinson, son of Joseph Robinson, had been skinning some of the cattle. Next morning early, I went down to see Proctor. He was so swollen and bloated I would not have recognized him. He died that night. Next day, I went on the range and saw a lot more dead cattle.
whatever their deeds, the Fancher party continued to excite strong feelings against its members by both Mormons and Indians. As the company moved south, the Indians began to follow it. Leaving an upset community behind, the Fancher party moved 35 miles southwest of Cedar City to a site known as Mountain Meadows. The band of Indians that had been tracking the company for some time quietly surrounded the unsuspecting encampment. Early Tuesday morning, September 8, 1857, the Indians rushed the immigrants.
They made their attack just before daybreak, running down the slope of the hills on the east, yelling and shooting. Taken completely by surprise, the men took a little time to rally, gather their arms, and return the fire, which they did with such effect that several of the Indians were killed and others retreated. Lee says, John D. Lee, that 7 of the men of the company were killed and 3 others were badly wounded.
When Mormon military leaders in Cedar City learned of the attack, they called for the farmer to the Pedes, John D. Lee, to come from his home at Harmony and attempt to control the hostile Indians. Following a tension-filled meeting at Cedar City, the leaders also directed James Haslam to ride to Salt Lake City and ask President Brigham Young what position they should take in regard to this very difficult situation, one in which they might well be pitted against the Indians in the whole southern district should they attempt to intervene at Mountain Meadows. In a little over 3 days of hard riding, James arrived in Salt Lake. President Young gave him an immediate express saying,
"Go with all speed. Spare no horseflesh. The immigrants must not be meddled with if it takes all Iron County to prevent it."
After a hard ride, Elder Haslam reached Cedar City on September 13, 1857, with his urgent message from Governor Young. Unfortunately, it arrived too late to prevent certain members of the local militia from joining the Indians in a terrible massacre of the Fancher party. Without waiting for an answer from the north, a unit of the Iron Militia was ordered to Mountain Meadows to assist the Indians in the shameful deed. Through an act of treachery, the Arkansas and Missouri defenders were lured out of their wagon barricade, and the majority of them were done away with by whites and Indians. The only survivors were 17 of the younger children, who were kept in Mormon homes until 1859, when Jacob Forney, superintendent of Indian Affairs, gathered them up and sent them east to live with relatives. Commenting in later years on this outrageous massacre, Elder Joseph Fielding Smith called it the most horrible and shocking crime ever perpetrated within the borders of the state. He further stated,
"It was the deed of enraged Indians, aided by a number of white men, who took vengeance into their hands for wrongs committed by a few of the emigrants, who were pronounced enemies of both white and Indians. It was a crime for which there can be no apology or excuse."
Far removed from this scene of death and destruction, official carriers of the nation's mail system were responding to public opinion for a quicker cross-country communication between the eastern and western United States. In answer to this need, Russell, Majors, and Waddell organized a unique mail service over the central route, known as the Pony Express. Through a system of relay stations and the employment of fine riders and horses, mail could be sent from St. Joseph, Missouri, via Salt Lake City to Sacramento, California, in 10 days' time. This was a phenomenal achievement for that day and a blessing to the Saints. This brought the Saints within 6 days' communication with the frontier and 7 from Washington, D.C. The completion of the Pacific Telegraph spelled the end of the brief but colorful Pony Express in October 1861. Now messages, which had cost $5 plus postage to send by horseback, could be sent by wire at a minimum charge and with lightning speed. The invention of the electric telegraph by Samuel F.B. Morse provided the means for a transcontinental wire across the United States. Work had begun at Omaha on one side and California on the other. The Pacific Telegraph Company completed 1,100 miles from Omaha to Salt Lake on October 24th and was provided poles westward to Ruby Valley by Little and Decker. On October 18th, President Brigham Young sent the first message over the new wire to the president of the Pacific Telegraph Company, J.H. Wade, congratulating him and his associates on the completion of the line and affirming,
"Utah has not seceded, but is firm for the Constitution and laws of our once happy country, and is warmly interested in such useful enterprises as the one so far completed."
Following the arrival of Johnston's army, an estimated 4,000 federal troops were located at Camp Floyd, in Dobytown or Frogtown, Fairfield. Another 3,000 non-Mormon suppliers, employees, and camp followers established themselves next to the camp. This instant community provided an excellent market for Mormon produce such as garden crops, hay, straw, grain, and meats. The outbreak of the Civil War caused the evacuation of Camp Crittenden. Camp Floyd was renamed Crittenden following the defection of John B. Floyd to the south in July 1861. Even in closing, there were certain economic gains to the Mormons.
The abandonment of the post in 1861 led to what was probably the largest government surplus property sale yet held in the history of the nation. At one large auction, which commenced on July 16, 1861, the Army sold an estimated $4 million worth of property for approximately $100,000.
So ended, wrote William Clayton, the great Buchanan, Utah expedition, costing the government millions and accomplishing nothing, except making many of the Saints comparatively rich and improving the circumstances of most of the people of Utah. The Mormons had their first opportunity to show their loyalty to President Abraham Lincoln in May 1862. When the soldiers abandoned Camp Crittenden, Camp Floyd, they left the overland mail and telegraph without needed protection. Due to Indian attacks on the stations of the Overland Mail Company, President Lincoln wired President Brigham Young on April 28, 1862.
You are requested to muster into the service of the United States a company of Utah Volunteer Cavalry, to arm and equip them immediately, and send them east for the protection of the mail and telegraph lines extending from North Platte River below Independence Rock on the old Mormon Trail to Fort Bridger.
From May 1, 1862 to August 14th, Major Lot Smith commanded a company of 120 men in performing this valuable service to the government. The responsibility of protecting the northern mail route and the telegraph was turned over to Colonel Patrick E. Connor and the 3rd California Volunteers following the arrival of that command in Salt Lake City on October 20, 1862. In addition to preventing Indian hostilities, they were also instructed to keep an eye on the Mormons. Rather than locating at Camp Crittenden, Colonel Connor selected a new site for his post, Camp Douglas, on the East Bench overlooking the Mormon capital. Despite the distasteful and often antagonistic presence of another military force in their midst, the Saints received a renewed boost to their economy by furnishing supplies to the camp. From the heights above Salt Lake, Colonel Connor's command could observe developments within the city.
Pleasing gardens surrounded many of the plain adobe dwellings. There were few imposing buildings to be seen other than the old tabernacle, completed in 1851 as a center for Mormon religious services and for numerous civic gatherings, and the Salt Lake Theater, opened the preceding March. Nevertheless, as an oasis in the arid Intermountain country, the city elicited fervent praise from visitors. The cultivated farmlands of the surrounding and neighboring valleys bespoke the industry and ingenuity of the inhabitants, and the far-flung settlements of the territory paid tribute to the colonizing genius of their leader. Salt Lake City deserved its fame as the Mormon capital.
A far-reaching effect of the U.S. Army's presence in Utah was connected with the great mineral wealth of the territory. Many of the members of the 3rd California Volunteers had been drawn to the west by their interest in mining. According to T.B.H. Stenhouse, the first discovery of ore by the military occurred as follows.
A party of soldiers from Camp Douglas were guarding some horses belonging to the garrison, which had been sent to graze in Bingham Canyon. They were joined one day by General Connor and a picnic party of officers, and their wives from camp, and one of the ladies, while rambling on the mountainsides, picked up a loose piece of ore. The soldiers at once prospected for the vein, discovered it, and striking a stake in the ground, made their location.
While Colonel Connor and his California Volunteers were making their influence felt in the territory, staunch reformers in the Congress of the United States were voicing their strong opposition to the practice of polygamy among the Saints in Utah. Congressman Justin Morrill of Vermont, who had made 2 unsuccessful attempts to secure passage of an anti-bigamy bill, finally sponsored a bill which became law under the signature of President Abraham Lincoln in July 1862. The Morrill anti-bigamy law was designed to punish and prevent the practice of polygamy in the territories of the United States and to disapprove and annul certain acts of the territorial legislature of Utah. The law levied fines and jail terms for the practice of bigamy and limited the value of real property that a religious organization could hold in a territory to $50,000. President Lincoln, concerned with the rebellion in the South, chose not to enforce the new law. When asked by T.B.H. Stenhouse what course he intended to pursue in regard to the Mormons, Lincoln replied,
Stenhouse,
When I was a boy on the farm in Illinois, there was a great deal of timber on the farms which we had to clear away. Occasionally, we would come to a log which had fallen down. It was too hard to split, too wet to burn, and too heavy to move, so we plowed around it. And that's what I intend to do with the Mormons. You go back and tell Brigham Young that if he will let me alone, I will let him alone.
For their part, the Mormons held the moral law to be unconstitutional and ignored it for a decade and a half. Between 1865 and 1868, the most serious and disastrous of the Indian wars in the history of Utah took place, the Black Hawk War. The war was apparently ignited when a disagreement took place between John Lowry and Chief Yennywood during a peace conference in Manti on April 9, 1865. The war soon spread to many parts of the country. At the same time, the Navajo Indians were at war with whites and making raids on settlers in northern Arizona and southeastern Utah. The first tabernacle of the Saints in Utah was located on the southwest corner of Temple Square and dedicated on April 6, 1852. The building could seat only 2,200 people comfortably. A Bowery was constructed on the north of the tabernacle that could seat an additional 8,000 saints. The Bowery, covered with brush, provided shade, but was not much protection from rain, cold, or wind. Because of the pressing need for a building with a greater capacity, a new tabernacle was begun in 1864. By 1867, the building was completed, but without the present balcony, which was added in 1870. This addition allowed the seating of 8,000 persons. The tabernacle was built by pioneer artisans who took pride in their work. The ability of these men to frame the structure using such accessories as wooden pegs and rawhide bindings has been a marvel to present-day architects. They are similarly amazed by its superb acoustical qualities. A pin dropped near the pulpit can be heard distinctly in the opposite end of the auditorium some 200 feet away. Even before the completion of the transcontinental telegraph in 1861, President Brigham Young had visualized the building of a north-south line running from Cache Valley on the north to the Virgin River Valley on the south. This territorial telegraph would connect more than 100 isolated Mormon settlements within the Great Basin. The proposed Deseret telegraph had to wait until after the Civil War, however, as the Saints could not get the necessary wire, batteries, insulators, sending and receiving sets, and other equipment required for the line. The poles for the Deseret telegraph were set and ready for wire by the fall of 1866. By the 1st of December, 1866, the line from Salt Lake City to Ogden was complete. Communication between Logan and St. George was opened by January 15, 1867, and the remainder of the projected line was in operation within 30 days. The Deseret telegraph saved many lives during the latter half of the Black Hawk Indian War, when reports of the movements of the Indians in the central and southern part of the territory were relayed from settlement to settlement. With the construction of the line, President Brigham Young was able to direct the affairs of the church from St. George during the winters he spent in Utah's Dixie. President Abraham Lincoln signed the long-awaited Pacific Railroad Act on July 1, 1862. News of the signing reached Utah that same day via the transcontinental telegraph line. With the passage of that act, President Brigham Young and the Saints hoped that the day would soon come when Utah could be united with the rest of the nation, both the East and the West. Groundbreaking ceremonies for the Central Pacific Railroad were conducted in Sacramento on January 8, 1863. The Central Pacific would build from California toward the east. The Union Pacific held its groundbreaking ceremonies on December 2, 1863, in the Missouri River bottoms 2 miles north of Omaha, Nebraska. Its men were to lay track from the east to the west and eventually join rails with the Central Pacific construction crew. On May 6, 1868, Thomas C. Durant, the principal promoter of the Union Pacific, telegraphed President Brigham Young and asked for Mormon assistance. It was later agreed that the Mormons would grade the road from the head of Echo Canyon to the Salt Lake Valley, a distance of 44 miles, going around the north end of the Great Salt Lake. In September 1868, the Mormons also entered into a contract with President Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific to grade his road from the Utah-Nevada line east. The Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads joined rails at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory on May 10, 1869. A special ceremony held in honor of the event involved some 500 to 600 actual spectators and an entire nation via telegraph. Among other invited guests at the ceremonies were Bishop John Sharp of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Mayor Loren Farr of Ogden, who represented President Brigham Young. The U.S. 21st Infantry on its way to the Presidio of San Francisco was represented by several of its companies and the regimental band. The Mormon Church's 10th Ward Band of Salt Lake City also provided music. A specially fashioned California laurel wooden tie was put in place at the point of joining. Following prayer, a series of brief addresses were accompanied by the placing of a number of ceremonial spikes. The driving of the last spike, a gold one, was to be done by Stanford and Durant using a wired sledgehammer so that the sound would be transmitted to all America by telegraph. Both Stanford and Durant missed the spike at the first blow. However, W.N. Skilling, the Union Pacific operator, tapped out 3 dots for the first blow and 1 for the missed blow of Durant and alerted the people from coast to coast when the deed was done. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad now allowed thousands of saints to travel to Utah in a fraction of the previous time, and with minimal costs without having to experience the dangers of the trail. For some time, the leaders of the church had experienced difficulty with some anti-Mormon merchants in the territory who had campaigned against the Mormons in Washington, D.C. on a variety of issues. Now, with the coming of the railroad, the brethren saw the prospects of a flood of cheap Eastern goods smothering many local industries. President Young concluded that some drastic steps would need to be taken to save the economy of the saints. Plans had been laid as early as 1868 for the formation of Zion's Cooperative Mercantile Institution, or ZCMI. This enterprise would give the Mormons greater control over trade and commerce policies in the territory. The new institution finally opened for business on March 1, 1869, in the Eagle Emporium, a block south of the LDS Church headquarters. Still another store was opened in the old Constitution building on March 10, 1869. Just 1 month later, April 21, 1869, ZCMI opened its first retail department on Main Street in a store formerly occupied by N.S. Ransohoff and Company. Branches of ZCMI were soon located in every major community in Utah Territory. Profits from the wholesale and retail merchandising of the cooperatives also turned to the manufacture of clothing, leather, shoes, and other commodities. In 1873, a national depression gripped America. In Utah, it created widespread unemployment and upset prices. The severe economic circumstances, plus the growing strength of the anti-polygamy forces, served to further impress President Young with the necessity of making the saints independent from reliance on the world and its goods. After examining the prospects, Brigham Young determined to introduce a system of united orders. As he traveled northward to Salt Lake from St. George in the spring of 1874, President Young instituted the movement in numbers of the communities and set the program in motion. The United Order took different forms to meet the needs of a particular settlement or situation. In St. George and some other southern Utah communities, the plan called for the pooling of individual property to be worked cooperatively under a board of management. At Brigham City, where an early form of the United Order was already underway, the whole community was organized around a system of cooperatives. In some of the larger cities, such as Salt Lake, Ogden, and Logan, the orders were limited to single enterprises organized in each ward, such as a hat factory, tailor shop, or the manufacture of soap. Among the best known of the orders was that of Orderville, Utah, which was formed for the express purpose of creating a united order. Begun in 1875, the Orderville Saints deeded all their property, both real and personal, to the community corporation. They built houses in a semi-fort arrangement around the town square and erected a large common dining hall in the center. Unfortunately, over a period of time, the young men of Orderville became a subject of ridicule by the youth of other communities who chided the fellows on their floppy straw hats, gray jeans, and valley tan shoes created by the order. The oldsters forming the Orderville Board of Management were under pressure to provide some relief. They agreed to use some store-bought pants as a pattern, to acquire some cloth, and to make some more acceptable pants when the existing pants were worn out. As the objectionable pants never seemed to wear out, the young men of Orderville sped the process. Mark Pendleton related.
The tailoring department was soon swamped with orders for pants. The elders of the order protested. The boys went to work, as usual, but loafed on the job. It was noticed that the everlasting pants worn by the boys were getting thin in spots, and even some holes had developed. These boys were often on their knees when at prayers, or when weeding in the garden, but not much time was spent sitting down. Why was this unusual wear on the seat of the pants? When the elders saw the boys going in groups to the shed where the grindstone was housed, they became suspicious and investigated. Yes, the boys were wearing out their pants on the grindstone. The elders protested and then capitulated. A load of wool was dispatched to Washington Mills to trade for cloth. The tailor shop was a busy place. The boys were hard at work. The Pants Rebellion was over.
One of the first concerns of President Brigham Young following the arrival of the Saints in the Salt Lake Valley had been the identification of a site for a temple. The magnitude of that structure, however, was to require 40 years for its construction. A temporary substitute for the temple, known as the Endowment House, was completed in the northwest corner of the Salt Lake Temple block on April 27, 1855, in order to accommodate ordnance work. This two-story adobe structure could not meet all the needs of an expanding church populace, and on November 9, 1871, Elder George A. Smith was directed by President Young to dedicate a temple site at St. George, Utah. On April 6, 1877, the 47th annual conference of the church was held in St. George, at which time the completed temple was dedicated by Daniel H. Wells. Dedicatory services were held over a 3-day period, and on each of these solemn occasions, Elder Lorenzo Snow led in the Hosanna shout with beautiful dignity. President Brigham Young spoke at each of the assemblies, but was very weak physically and had to be carried about in an armchair. Wilford Woodruff, who served as president of the temple from 1877 to 1884, related a singular circumstance experienced by himself in the fall of 1877, which confirmed the importance of the ordinances performed for the dead in the house of the Lord. To a gathering of saints assembled in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, he affirmed,
I feel to say little else to the Latter-day Saints wherever and whenever I have the opportunity of speaking to them than to call upon them to build these temples now underway, to hurry them up to completion. The dead will be after you. They will seek after you as they have after us in St. George. They called upon us knowing that we held the keys and power to redeem them. I will here say, before closing that 2 weeks before I left St. George, the spirits of the dead gathered around me wanting to know why we did not redeem them. Said they, you have had the use of the endowment house for a number of years, and yet nothing has ever been done for us. We laid the foundation of the government you now enjoy, and we never apostatized from it, but we remained true to it and were faithful to God. These were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and they waited on me for 2 days and 2 nights. I thought it very singular that notwithstanding so much work had been done, and yet nothing had been done for them. The thought never entered my heart from the fact, I suppose, that heretofore our minds were reaching after our more immediate friends and relatives. I straightway went into the baptismal font and called upon Brother McAllister to baptize me for the signers of the Declaration of Independence and 50 other eminent men, making 100 in all, including John Wesley, Columbus, and others. I then baptized him for every president of the United States except 3. And when their cause is just, somebody will do the work for them.
Following the dedication of the St. George Temple, President Young journeyed to Manti, where on April 25, 1877, he dedicated a site in that community for the building of a temple. Early in the morning of that same day, Brigham Young and Brother Warren S. Snow had gone alone to the site of the proposed dedication, and standing on the spot where the southeast corner would be, President Young affirmed,
Here is the spot where the prophet Moroni stood and dedicated this piece of land for a temple site. And that is the reason why the location is made here, and we can't move it from this spot. And if you and I are the only persons that come here at high noon today, we will dedicate this ground.
While working in his Salt Lake office on August 23, 1877, President Young complained of feeling extreme nausea. That evening, he was seized by a severe attack of cholera morbus. He continued to decline, and on Wednesday, August 29th, the anxious watchers at his bedside knew that the end was near. Gazing fixedly upward, President Young uttered as his last words,
Joseph, Joseph, Joseph,
as though speaking with his beloved prophet. President George Q. Cannon represented the heartfelt sentiments of the brethren and the saints as he delivered one of the funeral sermons.
On Tuesday night, as I sat at the head of his bed, President Young's, and thought of his death, if it should occur, I recoiled from the contemplation of the view. It seemed to me that he was indispensable. What could we do without him? He has been the brain, the eye, the ear, the mouth, and the hand for the entire people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He had that power, that wonderful faculty which God gave him and with which he was inspired. And while I was thus thinking of all this, it seemed as though we could not spare him. He was indispensable to this great work. And while I felt it, it seemed as though a voice said, I am God. This is my work. It is I who build it up and carry it forward. It is my business to guide my saints.
Ever directing the affairs of the church, the Lord had prepared yet another prophet in the person of President John Taylor to continue the growth of the earthly kingdom. Several years prior to the death of Brigham Young, the The president had contemplated measures that could be put in force to shield the people of Utah from the worldliness which the influx of strangers would bring at the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. He was particularly concerned about the young women of the church, whom he felt had not had an adequate opportunity to study and apply the principles of the gospel. President Young was particularly aware of this condition in his own large family. There were 56 children born to the pioneer leader. Sensing the need for regular instruction of a spiritual and intellectual nature, he laid the foundations of an organization for the Daughters of Zion, commencing with his own family. On November 28, 1869, he called all the members of his household together in the parlor of the Lion House. The only visitors were President and Sister George A. Smith. At the right of the president sat Aunt Eliza R. Snow. Addressing his family, Brigham Young said,
"All Israel are looking to my family and watching the example set by my wives and children. For this reason, I desire to organize my own family first into a society for the promotion of habits of order, thrift, industry, and charity. And above all things, I desire them to retrench from their extravagance in dress, in eating, and even in speech. The time has come when the sisters must agree to give up their follies of dress and cultivate a modest apparel, a meek deportment, and to set an example before the people of the world worthy of imitation. I want you to set your own fashions. Let your apparel be neat and comely, and the workmanship of your own hands. We are about to organize a retrenchment association which I want you all to join. And I want you to vote to retrench in your dress, in your tables, in your speech, wherein you have been guilty of silly, extravagant speeches and light-mindedness of thought. Retrench in everything that is bad and worthless, and improve in everything that is good and beautiful. Not to make yourselves unhappy, but to live so that you may be truly happy in this life and the life to come."
A married daughter of President Young, Ella Young Empey, was sustained as president of the Retrenchment Association, the name of which was later changed to the Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association. During the year 1870, associations were organized in nearly every ward in Salt Lake. Quickly spreading throughout the church, this organization soon numbered its members in the thousands. Under the immediate direction of President Brigham Young, Junius F. Wells was called upon to organize the young men of the church in 1875. President Young instructed Brother Wells,
"We want to have our young men enrolled and organized throughout the church, so that we shall know who and where they are, so that we can put our hands upon them at any time for service that may be required. We want them to hold meetings where they will stand up and speak, get into the habit of speaking, and of bearing testimony. These meetings are to be for our young men, to be composed of young men for their mutual improvement. A society of young men for mutual improvement. There's your name, the Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. Many may think they haven't any testimony to bear, but get them to stand up, and they will find the Lord will give them utterance to many truths they had not thought of before. More people have obtained a testimony while standing up trying to bear it than down on their knees praying for it."
Following the death of President Brigham Young, his successor, President John Taylor, recognized the need of special religious training for children. Although parents had a specific responsibility to instruct their youngsters, it was thought appropriate to assist them in their labors through an auxiliary organization called the Primary Association. Sister Aurelia S. Rogers had felt a distinctive need for more religious and moral instruction among the children of Farmington, Utah, and the church generally, believing that they should be taught to beautify the home with their own workmanship and develop a love for music, flowers, and the beautiful things of the world which surrounded them. When this matter was brought to the attention of Sister Eliza R. Snow, she consulted with President John Taylor, Emmeline B. Wells, and others. It was determined that the Primary Association should be formed to aid in the development of upright men and women. With this resolve, Sister Aurelia S. Rogers was set apart to preside over the Primary Association in Farmington, Utah on August 11, 1878. The organizational steps taken were as follows.
The ward was systematically visited and the name of every child recorded. 2 weeks later, August 25, 1878, the children were called together. The object of the work was explained to them, and the career of the association began. In addition to the meeting, where general instructions were given, including lessons on obedience, faith in God, prayer, individual and in concert, punctuality, and good manners, There were program and testimony meetings. A quarterly gathering was held every 3 months to which the parents were invited and a special program rendered. Lessons were given on the planting of beans and corn to be stored for times of famine, in the making of rag carpets for use in church buildings, and much emphasis was laid on the necessity for obedience to the word of wisdom.
The inspired teachings of the primary have given the children an understanding of good and noble actions which strengthen our Father's kingdom. The General Conference of the Church held in April 1880 was a very special gathering, for it was the Jubilee Conference. April 6th marked the 50th year since the organization of the church on the Peter Whitmer Senior Farm in Fayette Township, New York. In consequence of this, President John Taylor declared it to be the year of the Jubilee. In ancient Israel, every 50th year was a Jubilee. During that period, the poor debtor was released. Also, the man who had sold himself to his brother to be his hired servant was set free. Together with all that was his wives and his children, and they returned to their inheritance. President Taylor stated,
"It occurred to me that we ought to do something as they did in former times, to relieve those that are oppressed with debt, to assist those that are needy, to break the yoke off those that may feel themselves crowded upon, and make it a time of rejoicing."
Accordingly, President Taylor proposed to the congregation of the church that 1/2 of the people's indebtedness to the Perpetual Immigration Fund Company be released. Those saints who were poor and struggling with the difficulties of life would be released from the entire amount owed the PEFC. However, it was thought only fair that those individuals who could pay the debt, but had neglected to do so, should have their names kept on the books for the amount owed the church. President Taylor also called for 1,000 cows to be distributed among the destitute families of the various stakes. Similarly, 5,000 head of sheep were to be given for the same purpose. He next called upon the Relief Society under Sister Eliza R. Snow to loan for seed purposes 34,761 bushels of wheat, which they had stored through their organization. Lastly, he petitioned the individual members to forgive one another their private debts, saying,
"If you find people owing, you who are distressed, if you will go to work and try to relieve them as much as you can under the circumstances, God will relieve you when you get into difficulties. I will tell you that in the name of the Lord. Let us act on a kind, generous, brotherly principle, doing good one to another and carrying out the principles of the everlasting gospel in our lives."